I have the privilege today to host the French-German composer Alexander Liebermann, who is well known already for his very exceptional work, inspired by bird singing, most of it, and bird observation, and yeah, many different aspects of this musical context, and is widely known also for his book Birdsong, a musical field guide, and political monodrams, and yeah, I think we know this, and we have something in common. We both love birds. And so when I meet an ornithologist, or even, you know, like in the context of our projects, birds is a permanent question. It's a permanent symbol. It's very much part of our ideas. So I'm very curious to learn a bit more about how did it happen that birds and their musicality and their relation to human music making became such a source of interest and inspiration for you, Alexander.
All right. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. And yes, likewise, you know, it's always great to meet a fellow bird lover, or like a birdsong aficionado. Yes, so birdsong is actually, I'm pretty recent to that entire field and loving, to be honest. And the pandemic was like the pivotal moment for me, where like I really got into birdsong. In 2019, I backpacked through Costa Rica with two friends of mine, and you know, I'm born in Berlin, but I'm a city person per se. I live in New York for the past 11 years, and yeah, I never really lived in the jungle or like was so close to nature like I was in Costa Rica. And so, you know, like there were monkeys peeing on us because we disturbed their place. And like I saw Montezuma oropendolas, then fascinating nests, you know, they fall down, gigantic nests, and their song is just like electronic music. Like I've never listened to anything like it. And so that was like a shock in some ways, but I didn't really realize it. And then I flew back to New York, and I took the last plane back home to Germany before they closed the borders, and it was a very like electric atmosphere. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about at this moment, where nobody knew what was going on. And so I flew back to Germany, and suddenly I found myself in my childhood room where I grew up at my parents' place, and working on my like doctoral thesis that I worked on. Like I wrote about Erwin Schuhoff. And so suddenly I was, you know, it was such a gigantic contrast between like Costa Rica and this nature, and to suddenly find myself in this childhood room. And so I don't really know what happened, but I think that kind of like was like just stirring up in my mind. And then I found myself on YouTube looking up different birdsong in like Central America or South America, and suddenly I realized, wow, these songs are just insane and so crazy, you know. And I was imagining like how they would look like in music, and that's how basically it started. I was just like starting to transcribe birdsong I find online, and that's it. And then suddenly I discovered
like writing it, like transcribing, like on note paper, like really like listening by
exactly.
what kind of methodology?
Yeah, no, I was just listening to it and be like, the first song I listened to was the song of the musician Ren called the Uirapuru. You know, Villa-Lobos wrote an entire piece like called the Uirapuru. But it's not so much based on the bird song. But anyway, so I was just like, wow, this bird song sounds very tonal. And it's true, I read like some articles about the song, you know, and it's kind of proven that the bird prefers kind of perfect intervals. So you have lots of perfect fourth and fifth and octaves, and it makes it sound kind of like tonal in parentheses to our ears. And so I transcribed it, I wrote it down to see what it feels like. So I do everything by ear. I wrote it down, and then I decided to share it on social media, and it kind of resonated. I think the timing was just right, because, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
everybody was at home. Everybody was just like quarantined. Everybody had this longing for nature, and suddenly like musicians saw like, wow, a bird song transcribed. So I think that resonated with everyone at that time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what caught my attention was that I mean, it's on an outside perspective, it's like these acoustical elements or this notation challenge in being precise and being, you know, like very accurate. From what I understood, I watched these the reed warbler this on your YouTube channel, and this also love this European goldfinch, you know, all this. I mean, there is so much symbolical also beauty in it, and so I was asking myself, I mean, like in this context, I would like to know, like, how would you describe like the idea of inspiration? I mean, you started to observe and to listen very carefully to this, I mean, to this diversity and richness of expression, of voices, of I mean, it's such a it's a whole world. So from this learning experience, would you say, like, really thinking from the bird perspective, are they inspired? I mean, this, like, when you're watching and listening to them, I mean, what is the idea of inspiration? Maybe it's a totally different concept, you know, very, yeah, maybe totally different perspective from all your observations and your conclusions.
Yeah, so I must say, like, it has changed a lot since I started doing that, because in the beginning I had a more, how to say, like, naive way of looking at it in some ways. Like, you know, I would write down, and I didn't read so much about birds, about, like, you know, how their syrinx works so that they can produce two pitches at once. So they, you know, in German we say like their vocal cords, their Stimmbänder, no, not Stimmbänder, Stimmkopf.
Die Stimmbänder, yeah.
Stimmkopf, yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they can produce two voices at once, you know, so these elements, that's why penguins, for example, produce, like, adult penguins, emperor penguins have like these thirds constantly throughout. And so I didn't know that, so I would just like transcribe as accurate as I can, but then I started also like slowing down recordings, which is a mistake too in some ways, because people think it makes things easier, but actually it's just a nightmare. It makes things so much more complicated, because when you start slowing things down, you hear all these, like, depending on the recordings, you might hear artifacts or stuff that's not there. But even then, sometimes you notice elements that pass by so fast that we don't hear them. So suddenly I find myself too with, like, questions, you know, like aesthetical, like ethical questions, like, who am I writing this for? Who am I doing this for? Because I could just transcribe everything like on a, you know, very accurate time scale, being like, this is there, but you don't listen to it. So what do I do, right? So in the end, I decided always to go with what I hear at real speed, because I'm doing this for us and not for the bird, right? But yeah, so there's so many elements that I had to go through and really think about, what am I doing for? It's like, these were really crucial questions, you know, because sometimes when I give these lectures too, I would ask the audience, like, what would you do? Would you rather prefer like an extremely accurate transcriptions with when I slow everything down so that it is as accurate as possible, or would you focus on the real speed? And it's actually funny, because sometimes most of the audience says, like, I would like to see what the real slowed down transcriptions look like.
Interesting.
But then it's very confusing for musicians, because you look at this transcription and you would not see what you hear. Right. So so yeah, this is really fascinating. But in terms of inspiration, then, like, it is really, really fueling my inspiration. I don't know, like, there's no it's no, you know, it's no wonder that, like, composers since the beginning of time have been inspired by birds. It's just like it's just really, really, really insane. Not only do they come with like a specific mood too, you know, it's like, it's also symbolism, like the cuckoo for the awakening of summer, the beginning of summer, the summer coming in. You have like nightingales representing the night. You have all the, you know, the owl you have so many composers use them in very different ways too. And
yeah.
and you also start to notice really interesting stuff. For example, I always thought the cuckoo sings in a third. And I was like, okay. But then in Mahler, it's a perfect fourth, right? Or like in chansons, it's a major third. Then you have a minor third too, like in different pieces. And actually, the cuckoo does sing all of them. So they're all correct, you know. Like when the cuckoo starts singing in April, it's first a minor third, and then mid-April it becomes a major third. And like in May, it's like almost like a
Amazing.
perfect fourth, and then it goes up even to a tritone sometimes.
Yeah,
So,
amazing, amazing.
so if you know that, okay, Mahler's cuckoo was probably around May, you know, that's like a fun fact. And then there's so many other details. I mean, to me personally, it's just like really inspiring too, because these songs are so complex that you can focus on even a small part of the song and you find so many incredible like licks, gestures. Some of them that are like, sometimes you find even very tonal aspects in them.
Yeah.
So, and you were speaking about inspiration for birds too. I mean,
yeah, from
that's
their
a question.
perspective, you know, like to have like this, like from so much observation experience and like specific recognition and this also description of the basic qualities of every bird.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be very fascinated to understand how would you describe the idea of inspiration from the bird perspective?
Yeah. Well,
You know, like
I'm not a,
what are they thinking? I mean, are they,
yeah,
you know, like
I
maybe they have,
know.
you know, it's they.
Well, yeah, I'm not a bird, so I cannot really answer that, and I'm not such a specialist too to be answering. But I've read a lot about this, and it's very complex too when you think that a lot of birds use like mimicry too. You know, like so. For example, the Blythe reed warbler that you saw like uses a lot of mimicry. So sometimes you would hear another bird in its song, and you'd be like, okay,
Yeah,
if you
interesting.
go to Australia and you like the lyrebird is probably known for being the best bird using mimicry. I mean, what is inspiration to these birds, right? Like, why do they do it? There's a story of the story of like a lyrebird that was found as a baby lyrebird in the beginning of the 20th century by a musician, a flute player, and she kept this lyrebird at her place while she was playing flute etudes. And when the bird was an adult, she released it, and now there's an entire lyrebird population that sings flute etudes in
Amazing.
Australia.
Oh,
So it'd be like just like was it like a source of
amazing.
inspiration for the birds too? Like so yeah, I don't I don't I don't know. Some birds also really learn the song of their parents, like on like almost orally transmitted music. I think zebra finches are like that. So they would really practice the song, right? And the parents would like be there, so they practice the song of their parents. So it's like a orally transmitted music, and it goes from like generation to generation.
Yeah,
And
I always wonder, like how this, if I try to, I mean, to put myself into this bird perspective and in this bird truth and bird goodness or bird beauty, from their access to reality. Like speaking to you, it's this. Does this change also, like in your methodology, that you take new criterias, like new parameters in like focusing, for example, on a specific quality like sincerity or bareness of the voice or the ability itself? Like, does that, how is your methodology developing?
yeah, so that's changing too, because like now I'm trying to find a very idiosyncratic way of notating it. So I'm trying to become because sometimes there's lots of noise, there's very clear whistles depending on birds too. Sometimes they do both. Then sometimes you have a mixture. Sometimes you have two pitches at once. Sometimes you have trills mixed with different sounds. So it's like it's a very versatile depending on the bird song or the bird, it can be a very versatile song using different elements. And so I tried to develop more and more my notation to almost find a very specific way to show certain things. So for example, for nightingales especially, nightingales have like, it's a very noisy, there's lots of noise, you know, like clicks, clicks, but also clear whistles. And sometimes it's both very fast, one to the next. So in some ways you could say it sounds like very contemporary music in some ways, you know, it's like noisy. And in contrast to like the blackbird, for example, that has more clear whistles, the Amse, right? So I decided to use different note heads. For example, sometimes you will find an X-shaped note head. That means it's mostly noise. If you have a diamond-shaped note head, it means it's in between a whistle and just a click. And if it's just a normal note head, it means it's a clear whistle. So if you look at these transcriptions I do now, you will find that like, oh, okay, if you read them with that in mind, you can see, okay, this is mostly noise, then it's a clear whistle, then it goes back to something in between. And this is one aspect to do that. Then I
so in the notation, like also to be like more and more precise in all the subtle differences.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it really changes like in a fraction of a second. You have several of these things. So it's like extremely virtuosic. So you see all these little details within like, you know, you have like 12 notes and they all happen in like 12 milliseconds or something. And they have a whistle, some clicks and everything. So yeah, I try to develop a more and more, how do you say, accurate way to show what birdsong might look like on sheet music.
Yeah, this way you very interesting. You answered already the one question I also had, like what this kind of research and also notation, the development of notation techniques and really accurate how to say, the Übertragung, you know, on different instrument groups for woodwinds or for like, for the flute or for a drum section, for different drums or even string section, like there's all so many specific contexts. And I wanted to ask from you as a professional, I mean, really as a musician, also as a listener, what abilities could you develop thanks to this research and thanks to these birds? I mean, what did they teach you?
Yeah, well, they taught me a lot of things. First of all, probably to be very humble because
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, also to be more like, you know, when you read that some birds are just disappearing or threatened by extinction, and you actually transcribe these things and you notice how complex they are, and you know that it took millions of years to develop at this point. You just know that like, wow, yeah, we actually lose something, you know, like something really important. Yeah, I don't know where to start with this because there are just so many things you can learn. To maybe just name one, for example, I actually moderated a children's concert with the Orchestra des Wandels 2 years ago
in Berlin,
in Sinsheim. We went in Sinsheim, so southern of Germany, and I used a lot of the transcription I had, and I like put them for different instruments, and then they were played. But so that's a great way also to introduce children to, like, you know, the environment and birdsong, but then also to instruments, and even more like to the environment, and like also that, you know, what is endangered, because among one of the bird species, there was like a bird that's extinct, recently extinct, right? So, and I transcribed it, and it was performed by a musician. But first we showed the original birdsong, and then it was played by an instrument. And the musician was like an incredibly talented musician, but when you play it on an instrument, you realize the contrast between the real thing and when we do it. You know, suddenly you'd be like, wow, this is actually beautiful, but maybe not as incredible as the real thing.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then people realize, wow, we will actually never be able to hear this in real,
Mm.
although it is
Mhm.
transcribed and saved in some form or another. We have the recording, obviously, but like we as a species really fail in imitating it as
Oh yeah.
beautifully as it gets. And that was like a very suddenly sad moment in that concert because
Mm.
suddenly, people realize, oh my God, like we actually lose something with it. And it's always to me fascinating because, as a musician or artist, we have a very important role too in this case because when a politician tells you like, give me your money, we need to save the world or like save this bird species, you don't really like know where your money goes. You
Mm.
don't feel very motivated. But when you suddenly touch somebody emotionally, with something like that or musically,
Mm.
an audience or a person that feels something is much more inclined to actually help, you know,
Oh yeah.
like being like, oh my God, actually, this is like, everybody gets goosebumps when you listen to that song and then you try to imitate it because it's a very beautiful song. And the bird doesn't exist for like the last,
Ah, incredible. And
until
wonder,
it
I mean,
extinct. Yeah.
wonderful to also to introduce this to children and in schools, because I mean they not only have a very direct access, but they hopefully will think further also in how to actually bring these realities together. And that's
Yeah.
that's really connecting to one topic which is very central in our programs and our ideas and the projects we are working on. And it's this idea of responsible listening or responsible listeners. We choose this, I've thought about it as a really as a question. It's for me, it's one of the biggest questions: what this is and what this could mean and should mean. It's I think quite challenging in the world we are living, because it's the connecting what we are listening and then taking responsibility for it. Sometimes, it's a bit disconnected. And
Exactly. Yeah.
this, yeah, how would you, I mean, from this, from this, taking the European goldfinch as an example, I mean, from this bird reality, from their universe, from their world, and from their Silk Roads, like their ideas, which we just, probably just don't understand yet. But when you look into your observations and your research and also your transcriptions, how is this idea of responsible listeners, like birds as responsible listeners? Are there how would you reflect on that? Or are there, like, what are the first impressions which come in this context?
Um, so first, I think there's birds can teach us something like, again, to teach that we're part of like a global culture too.
Mm.
So in some ways, for example, I grew up in Berlin.
Mhm.
And Berlin is the city with most nightingales in Europe. There's no city with
It's
more
amazing.
nightingales.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I grew up with these sounds and they shaped the soundscape of my youth, right? I mean, when I was like going to a party when I was like 17 or something and come back
Mm.
home very late or something, these birds would sing in the Tiergarten or whatever in every park. And, it's very important because they shape a soundscape.
Oh
You
yeah.
could put me there, like you could play this and I would exactly know where I am.
Mhm.
These nightingales, like at night, very specific song.
Mm.
But I've never been taught in school, nowhere, until like I read about them like 4 years ago, that nightingales spend half the year in countries southern of the Sahara.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know? So suddenly I'm just like, wow, actually these bird songs that I've been listening to, they they spent half the year in like countries from West Africa to Uganda.
Mm.
And suddenly I share something with the culture that I seemingly had nothing in common before,
Mm.
right? So suddenly I'm extremely close to somebody from Uganda and we could talk about nightingales or something, which is
Yeah, yeah,
insane
yeah.
to me. So birds don't know any borders.
Hmm.
They just they just travel. It's like one organic culture, you know, in some ways. So I think this is very beautiful, and it's very humbling, because nightingales are kind of known because they travel 8,000 kilometers or more and come back to the same tree.
Yeah.
Come back to the same tree. So you could go back to Berlin and be your
Incredible.
favorite musician.
Yeah, amazing.
Insane, you know?
Amazing.
I
It's
get lost.
really
I get
amazing.
lost in New York sometimes, and these
Yeah.
animals find their way back to the same tree. And suddenly you're like, you're very humbled by that, because they travel so much. They come back there. They've seen so much of the world, and they just teach you that, like, yeah, it's not different continents, different like countries, different things. It's like one part of one, you know, one culture, basically, like one natural, one world.
Do I understand you right? Like in this sense, responsibility, or in this sense, responsibly listening to certain qualities or values or even criteria, which we just take into consideration, but it's so wise, it's so clear, or so responsible.
Yeah, you listen to them differently. You know, when you know they've been like away half the year, like what they've seen. They are this, you know, and they come back to the same tree, and suddenly you listen to them, and they have such a beautiful song. You just like, you stand
Beautiful
just
example.
silently there, and you listen to that, and you're just like, wow. You know, like, you spent the winter in Berlin, and they've been in Uganda and come back and sing to you. So it's very humbling, you know. And they've been
very
like,
fascinating.
like the musician and ornithologist and clarinetist David Rothenberg says, you know, I played with him live with Nightingale in the Tiergarten in Berlin. And he said, like, they've been doing this for millions and millions of years, so there must be something right about it.
Very good, well done. Yes.
And it's very true. Like, we're a newcomer. We're doing music for the past 5,000, I don't know, maybe, you know, I mean, the oldest flute is like 50,000 years, but even that, in their proportion, it's ridiculously, you know, young.
Alexander, one last question. I have to look on the clock.
Yep.
When we think of a conference of the birds, this term conference of the birds, we were like the Sacred Symphony Orchestra, Kalias Foundation, Kalias Ensemble, like in our projects, we use it as a metaphor, like purely symbolically, for a global audience, but also as like the best qualities in the other, like in this very in a dialogue sense. And the idea originally came from a book I read from Farid Uddin Attar, this Persian writer and a mystic, like from who wrote this book, The Conference of Birds, Conference of the Birds. And like from your experience now, like observing around the world and really following a different idea of a conference of the birds, what associations come to you, and how would you, I mean, or how could we include your research, your ideas, and also your learning, your experience into this picture of a conference of the birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, first, I like to answer the other question about the author you meant, because I read a little bit about it on the website that you have, and it reminded me of the legends surrounding the Eurasian wren called Soundkönig, because it kind of has a similar legend around it in German folklore, right? It's a story of like this, the birds had a conference, and they all decided who's the best, or who's the most beautiful bird. And so it was the one who could fly the highest or something. And like, I don't really know exactly what it was, but the eagle flew the highest. And so it said like, I'm the king, but on top of the eagle, there was like the Soundkönig, the small Soundkönig who was put on it. So he said, I flew, and then he flew higher. And so he kind of tricked all the other birds, and he won the competition basically. And that's why he was kicked then. all the other birds said like, oh, you know, you cheated us. So they kind of like put him aside, and that's why the Soundkönig is now kind of a lonely bird that lives on the ground because it wasn't kicked out, but it has a beautiful song, and like, but that's why we call it Soundkönig, right? Because he's the king of the,
yeah.
so there's a similarity
I didn't know
between
this. I
like,
didn't know this.
yeah, the kind of, it reminded me of that, like the story I read. About what was the author's name again? Like the
It's
Persian.
Farid Udin Attar. I hope I speak
Yeah,
it
okay.
correctly. In Farsi and in Persian. It's a bit, they have a different pronunciation, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and by the way, also in their culture, the nightingale is extremely important. Like it's called the bulbul, I think. The bulbul is the nightingale, and same. I spoke with some Iranian friends, and they said that like in poetry, they try to imitate the song of the bulbul, of the nightingale, because that's the biggest inspiration.
Yeah,
So,
thank you very much, really, for sharing this insights. Also, really to show the great. For me, it's also not only joy and a lot of like Staunen, how you say, I like
fascination.
fascination, but it's also really humorous, like humorful. You know, really,
Yeah,
there's
it
so
is
much
very,
great
yeah.
humor around it, and also I'm at the same time this very serious and also sad part what you mentioned, that this this mystery of this
Yeah, no, I agree. It's
world,
very
it's really in
versatile.
danger, and
It's very versatile, and also, you know,
yeah.
there's like lots of guidance you can find. You can find solace in that too, you know, and sometimes there's a lot of life models or like guidance too. There's the typical analogy, you know, of the bird that almost got caught by like prey. And what do? You know, they suddenly stop on a branch and start singing. Like, you
Ah,
know,
yeah,
live in the moment, like enjoy
amazing.
life. Sometimes you have difficult times, but if you go through, you know, just continue, be joyful, be happy. Like
Yeah,
there's
amazing.
like so many beautiful analogies with the bird
Yeah,
world.
yeah.
I really love it.
No, thank you
And
for reminding us, really. And I think it's a very, very important message, which I wish you really to spread further and to really sensibilize as many people as possible for this beauty, and that we have to take some responsibility as musicians, or where we are standing, to really, really make sure that we have common future also with these
yeah,
brothers.
I myself, you know, it started like five years ago now for me, and like I realized how important actually soundscapes are. Like we all grew up with a soundscape, so nobody is alone there. You
Yeah,
can
yeah,
be
absolutely.
anywhere around. There will be birds,
Yeah.
or sounds that will remind you of that place. So you grow up, and to lose that would actually be very, very sad, right? So we hang on that.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
I myself have never really thought about that
Yeah.
before these 5 years ago, you know. So suddenly I had this kind of epiphany, and it's true for everyone in some ways.